So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Wilfred Uko, and I'm the program advisor for ISSD Africa at Mexico. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar about context analysis tool, also known as the CAT. I'm from Wageningen University, as well as my colleagues, Abilav and Andrea Mottram, who are providing immense support in the background. And I have the pleasure of presenting together with a few speakers. I know they may be known to many of you, but first we have Louis Parling. Louis is the research director at Seed System. And just to note that Louis is a renowned international seed systems expert and has provided huge input throughout the development of the context analysis tool. We have Ted Holmquist. Ted is the Peace and Conflict Director at Mexico. And Ted has been instrumental in providing conflict analysis elements of the context analysis tool and guiding our thoughts on the usability of the CAT in fragile states. We also have Tog Gang and Maxwell Samaila, both our colleagues working with Mexico, Nigeria. Tog and Max have had first-hand experience with the CAT, having pilot tested the tool in Northeast Nigeria. And in this webinar, they will provide their reflections on conflict and agricultural components of the context analysis tool, respectively. Please, let's go to next slide. So basically on housekeeping, if you haven't done yet, please go straight to the lower part of your slide, or of your screen, sorry, and click on the global icon to select a language. That must be done by everyone. So click on that icon, select either English or French because we have interpretation. And again, on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see how to select view. You can switch between based on your preference. And of course, just to point out that only panelists' microphones and cameras are enabled. And you'll be required to introduce yourself in the chat, as well as all the questions should be fielded in the chat. And I'd like to mention that you're recording this webinar solely for sharing. Next slide, please. And so our agenda today will include a brief background on ISSD Africa, and we'll focus on the action learning topic 1. And we'll have a short background on the CAT, an overview of the CAT, and some reflections. And of course, we'll have some questions. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk briefly about the ISSD Africa. And the integrated sea sector development in Africa is basically funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, and of course seeks to address the key sea sector challenges in Africa through 8 action learning topics. And 2 of the topics, and you'll see the bolded ones, are led by Mexico. And topic 1 is the core of this webinar. And of course, through that topic, the context analysis tool has been developed to address the action learning questions that you can see on the slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a brief background of the context analysis tool in terms of basically why we think the CAT as a resource is important. And we know that conflict is basically on the rise around the globe. And we are seeing an upwards of 80 million people now displaced as a result of the conflicts, which is really a new record. And of course, agriculture-related responses are really important in these contexts. But more importantly, the focus is on seed as an important component of these agriculture-related responses. And of course, just to highlight an example by our colleague Steve Walsh, who works with USAID, he mentioned during the SAT webinar that up to 121 of the 185 agriculture-related proposals in the financial year 2021 had seed-related components. And of course, this is perhaps a clear indication how important seed is. And so to effectively intervene in fragile states, practitioners, humanitarian agencies, and other stakeholders must approach the seed-related activities differently from how they would be in more stable environments. And of course, as an example, in fragile contexts, infrastructure may be poorly developed, and I'm talking about roads, for instance. There may be few formal sales outlets, and extension services may be utterly weakened or even non-existent. And so to face these realities, we need to have approaches that are different from those that would be used in stable contexts. And so we also note that indeed there is no dedicated tool to help humanitarian actors understand context in fragile states and conflict settings, and then inform the design of seed interventions in these environments. And so we opted to create the context analysis tool. Next slide, please. So basically, in a nutshell, the development of the context analysis tool has been a joint effort between Mexico through its ISSD Africa activities that, of course, focus on fragile contexts, as mentioned previously. And we also note that lots of specialized tools are out there, but the problem is there is no dedicated tool to help our teams understand contexts in which these systems function, and more importantly, in the fragile states. And this often leads to blind seed interventions and, of course, poor development of the seed sector in fragile contexts. And so this guide, the CAT, then provides humanitarians or humanitarian actors with an analysis process to understand and strengthen these systems in conflict settings. And of course, we are presenting this work in English and French, and it is complemented by the seed emergency response tool, which of course focuses on seed interventions in emergency situations, and also incorporates, I would say, specific guidance on how to select appropriate responses through decision trees. And of course, the SAT was launched in the previous webinar, and I guess probably most of us were there, but we'll share a link to that as well. Next slide, please. And so briefly, I just want to walk us through, and this is going to be very brief, through the sections of the CAT. And summarily, we have three sections. Section 1 basically characterizes the conflicts and their effects on C system programming. Section 2 presents CAT methodology in two phases, where phase 1 assesses the patterns of conflicts, effects on C systems, and current status of C systems. Section 2 presents the phase 2 analyzes the opportunity and identifies the opportunities to improve C systems functioning. And finally, section 3 has practical tools for analyzing conflicts, C systems, as well as minimum technical standards for C system security assessment, and also provides tools for assessing specific seed security situations. We'll be able to reference all these sections throughout the presentation, and to help, of course, orient you with what the CAT looks like. But let me, at this point, invite Ted to take us through the conflict analysis section. Over to you, Ted.
Thank you very much, Wilfred, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Wilfred mentioned at the start, I work for Mercy Corps. I'm a Peace and Conflict Director on our Global Technical Support Unit, and I've really been working with the team here on the conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity components of the tool. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So as Wilfred mentioned, there are 2 phases to the toolkit. And in this first phase, this first section, we really talked about the characteristics of both conflict and seed systems. Now, my colleague Louise will be discussing the seed systems part of that right after me. But starting with the conflict characteristics, what we present in the tool at first is just a general overview of what we mean by conflict and how that's really how we discuss and describe that in the peace building field. And one of the starting points is a general definition that we share, which is that at its most basic, conflict is something that occurs when 2 or more parties believe that they have incompatible goals. And the key word here that we've italicized is believe. So our sense is that sometimes people believe that their goals are incompatible, but the aim of peace building is to see how we can actually find shared goals and common interests. But in addition to that, if we dig a little deeper, you see this image of the iceberg, and that's a very useful kind of image to sort of explain how we look at conflict as well, in the sense that there's certain things we see and certain things that we don't always see when we're talking about a conflict. Now, what's very visible and above the surface usually tends to be that direct physical violence. We're talking about war, we're talking about crime, violence, and fighting of different forms. And that's the most visible part of a conflict usually. But it's very important to know what's underneath the surface as well. What are those underlying tensions? Often we talk about structural and cultural violence. So structural violence is, for instance, laws or institutions that may discriminate against certain groups. And often that discrimination and exclusion can lead to conflict. Cultural violence can be the norms, the prejudice that can exist in a society that allows for that kind of discrimination. And again, creates this sense that some people are valued more than others or are not included. And that is often one of the key drivers of conflict. Together, we talk about those as being the root causes of conflict. So it's really important to understand the consequences of conflict and to analyze that. What are those, what is the violence that we see occurring, for example, but really know what's behind that as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. We can go into another part of this, again, sort of in terms of what's more visible and sometimes what's harder to what's less tangible at first, is also relevant in terms of peace. So, for example, this is a terminology that's often used, this idea of negative and positive peace. And again, negative peace is just the absence of violence, essentially. And thinking, well, if you're not in an overt war situation, then you might say, well, that's a peaceful society, or that's a peaceful scenario. But actually, as we just mentioned, there are these deeper underlying causes of conflict under the surface that might not be leading to physical violence right now, but could in the future. So therefore, we also talk about positive peace. And that is, as you see here in the definition, the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. I should mention that these graphics are drawn and the terms and the concepts are drawn from the Institute for Economics and Peace. And so it's very important to have that positive peace. And the Institute for Economics and Peace, they have 8 different factors for positive peace that they mention that you can see here that range from well-functioning government to a free flow of information to low levels of corruption and many others. And it's as important that we try and reinforce those to really have a truly peaceful society. If we could move to the next slide, please. So in the tool, We start by characterizing conflict systems, and then we also characterize seed systems. My colleague Louise will get into that in a little bit. And then in the second part of the tool, we talk about how these two connect. As Wilfred mentioned earlier, there's been little work on characterizing conflict in relation to seed system programming. That's the gap we were looking to plug here. But we also are, we've seen evidence of how this link does exist and why it's important for us to work on it. We see, for example, how violence can cause displacement, which means that ultimately farmers end up working in different agroecological contexts, and that presents challenges from a seed systems perspective. We see also in other situations where discrimination and exclusion related to conflict limits market access and participation for some groups. So this link between conflict and seed systems is very strong in many cases. On the flip side, though, we also feel that if you can foster inclusion and collaboration across conflict lines around a mutual interest related to agriculture, then you can help to build peace by connecting people. And there are many examples of that as well in programming in this area. If we go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to present now a couple of key concepts that we go over in the toolkit as well. And that again gets to this idea of how can we make sure that seed system programs are sensitive to conflict, both in terms of making sure that they don't exacerbate tensions, but also that they can maximize any positive effects on peace. And one of the key approaches we discuss here is the do no harm approach, which is really a cornerstone of conflict sensitivity. And one of the key elements within do no harm that we present in the tool is this idea of connectors and dividers. So dividers are those things that can divide groups in a conflict situation. In many cases, they can be linked to identity, whether that's religious or ethnic identity. They can be linked to government policies. They can be divisions over access to resources, and many of those things cause conflict. And to be conflict sensitive, you need to be aware of those so that you can make sure that you don't further exacerbate those divisions and cause more tension. But at the same time, we talk about connectors being very important. And those connectors are things that connect people. Despite being divided by a conflict, there are always things that connect people across those dividing lines. And then often, for example, that may be a marketplace where people can come together. So a program can also be conflict sensitive by saying, let's reinforce and strengthen those areas where there is a connection. Let's build on that to try and strengthen local capacities for peace. So in terms of the tool, what that means in terms of how to be conflict sensitive there, a large part of what we present as being important is that in the initial analysis you're conducting, in this context analysis, it's very important to have as wide and inclusive participation as possible. Another key element is how you ask questions. So if you're going to be conducting analysis around a conflict, it's very important that you understand the sensitivities of that and don't come in and ask questions that might be just a little bit too sensitive for groups to talk about openly before they've built, for instance, any kind of trust with you as an interlocutor. So knowing how to approach that very carefully. And we present some ideas for how to do that in terms of asking open-ended questions, perhaps some indirect questions to get a conversation flowing with the respondents that you're speaking with. If we could move to the next slide, please. So a second concept that was very important for us, we felt, was conflict savviness. So in addition to conflict sensitivity, which I just talked about, which has a lot of formal processes and procedures that you can follow, this idea of conflict savviness is very important in the sense that there is already a kind of implicit or informal conflict sensitivity that most people practice. When 8 actors are in a conflict environment, they have a general sense of these are some of the tensions that exist, these are some of the dangers we may face, and they have to navigate those in order just to deliver a program and keep themselves and the people they're working with safe. And I think that people do have a kind of intuitive ability and instinct for doing that. So conflict savvy for us refers to a set of skills someone might have that allows them to navigate the peculiarities or dangers of the conflict and to complete the task at hand without harming themselves or communities. And it's not only for aid workers where we see this conflict savviness, but it's also looking to tap into that conflict savviness with the counterparts and the stakeholders you're working with on the ground. So a conflict savvy informant can advise on, for example, which villages are accessible or which roads are mined as you're conducting a seed system program. A conflict savvy trader might know where to find scarce and adapted seed and how to move it even in turbulent times. So building on that is very important. And so as we know, the logistics of conducting an assessment in a conflict affected area can be formidable. So having conflict savvy informants and team members can really make a crucial difference. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So one of the final element I'll present here for you now is, well, how do you actually conduct that conflict analysis in practical terms? I've spoken about it a little bit, but we also share a tool within the wider tool on how to conduct conflict analysis, and it goes over some of the key steps. It talks about initially first defining your specific objective, and then also some of the elements that you might want to look into. So what are the major conflicts? What are the causes? As we talked about before, those root causes are very important. Who are the key actors that are involved? But also equally importantly is to understand what are the mechanisms for peace and conflict management and resolution, so that we can strengthen those, as we talked about. And lastly, drawing recommendations from stakeholders that you're speaking with and deriving your own for how to address the conflict. And as also mentioned briefly, very important to talk about how to use open-ended and indirect questions to broach sensitive topics and build a little bit of trust with the people you're speaking with. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Louise, who will talk to you a little bit more about the seed system elements. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ted, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to present the seed systems part, recognizing that it's very much integrated with the conflict insights that Ted has just shared. Let me say that I'm just going to present glimpses. The whole CAT is 50 pages long, quite dense, and I wonder if Wilfred mentioned that it's going to be released today. Next. Okay, so first of all, in assessing the context, like with conflict, we've developed a fairly rigorous system. The first issue to emphasize is that in conflict, as in normal time, we should look at all the seed systems that farmers use. The formal, the informal, the intermediary, all might be bolstered, even in conflict periods. Next. One of the things we've tried to do in assessing the context, and please look at this slide carefully, we've tried to identify what conflict features might affect seed system functioning. So for instance, if you look in the left column, you see the first four: length of the stability period, can farmers sow and harvest, theft, labor sharing arrangements, displacement or risk of displacement. All of these could very directly affect crop choice and management practices. That's just one example. Then we've taken from the field real practical insights. So if you look at the right, just to give examples, in North Kivu in the DRC, farmers are now planting crops earlier, specifically not to coincide with rebel attacks. If you go down the column, another example from northern Uganda, there the military is controlling the height of field plants such as cassava so that rebel fighters cannot easily hide. So very direct changes according to very specific conflict features. And how do we predict these more systematically? Next. In assessing the conflict, we have developed tools. This is a practical guide. It's not a theoretical one. There's a seed systems and conflict interview guide. Among the broad issues, if you can look down, scroll down, have land arrangements changed? Have labor or cooperative arrangements changed? Have the key supply channels changed for agricultural inputs, etc.? Next. Following the same tool, very specifically, has conflict changed the types of crops planted? Has it changed the types of varieties planted? The timing of planting? And I hope all of you, as we go through this webinar, start to think about your own experiences in the field. What has changed? What has remained the same? Next. And as a third set of tools in assessing the context, we have taken existing tools which are proven. So these are SSSA tools, and we've modified them. So we're not starting anew. We've taken proven tools and added a conflict lens. The guide talks extensively about data collection, both remote and on the ground. You know, of course, during a conflict, remote becomes extremely important in terms of data collection. And we look at stakeholder selection, who absolutely should be included, who might be avoided. You know, particularly in stakeholders, very often during a conflict, it's hard to do on-the-ground assessments with communities themselves, but this is what we think is the most vital. Next. Okay, moving from assessment, the second part of the guide is on programming. So how do you identify opportunities to improve seed system functioning? And I just want to give a sense here of the kinds of tools we give to you. First, they're decision trees. So for instance, this is one of the several decision trees. And it says, can a seed system intervention be designed to address the seed security constraint? So if you look at the left, there are a set of questions. So for instance, and this is just part of the table, you know, has the specific seed security constraint been identified? Going down. Has a response that addresses the constraint been identified? Going down. Very important. Has the specific response been tailored to farmer needs in this conflict context? And then what is the evidence? Next. We even develop decision trees linked to peace building. So we're doing exploratory work here. So can the seed system intervention be tied specifically to peace building efforts? And of course, this is Ted's valuable work. So if you go down on the left, have connectors and local capacities for peace been identified? Does the seed system intervention involve actors who serve as local capacity for peace? Does the seed system intervention, I seem to be cut here, include people who are connectors? Sorry, my screen is cut here. Okay, next. The final section of the CAT looks at real actions on the ground. These are numerous, but often very hard to find because they're not written up. Now, what surprised us in seeking cases is that there are actions on the ground which have been implemented to solve all the seed security constraints, or I should say the range. So there are interventions that deal with seed availability. There are interventions in conflict that deal with seed access. There are interventions that deal with quality, even in conflict times, and that was with seed-linked information. You know, we want more cases. We want more people to share cases, but let me give you a sense of some of them very quickly. Next. Okay, case number one, this is a case from Sierra Leone. You know, there was a brutal civil war that extended for almost 2 decades. So in terms of the implementation, peace days were held to open debate and help heal. Interestingly, peace days were explicitly linked to seed distribution. They wanted to ensure that the distribution was transparent, fair, and inclusive. The result is that implementers decided to give smaller amounts of seed, but to many, many more people. Seed aid had been creating divisions, not solutions. So the issue was how to get more people to benefit. Next. Another example, very different from Mali, and you might remember that the northern area is controlled by a whole range of insurgents. It's very volatile, and there are problems of seed availability. The implementer here, CARE among them, decided to move seed locally from conflict regions to non-conflict regions. But they did this for several reasons. They wanted to ensure that farmers' real crop and variety profiles were delivered. In this case, pearl millet, a very difficult crop. And they wanted to inject funds into the local economy. Now, what I want to stress with this Mali case is that it was in a very high stress region. So it wasn't just a conflict region, it was a rainfall region to 200 and 400 millimeters. It needed pearl millet of very specialized varieties. The only way to get these was working through local villages. So not importers, not formal seed sector, not NGOs. They used local farmer multipliers who multiplied pro-millet of the exact varieties needed and who are now continuing to supply emergency aid. Next. A third case is storage. Of course, storage is important in normal times. It's also really important in conflict periods. We're focusing here on the lightweight storage bags, the ones that are white polyurethane. Now, the advantage in a conflict is that they're movable. If displacement is necessary, they can also be hidden. They can be hidden in rafters and garden plots. There are many different brands. This is just to say, if you're thinking about conflict, thinking about storage. Conflict and storage go together. Next. Oops, let's see, I seem to have lost my screen. Okay, finally, this notion of conflict resilient crops. I think Mercy Corps developed it, but maybe some of you also are experimenting with it. So what is a conflict resilient crop? Well, it could be crops not usable in their raw form. So they're not worth stealing, something like soybean. It could be crops not requiring intensive management, so they can be left untended for weeks. So if you have to flee, your crops are still growing. This might be something like cassava. Or, a conflict-resilient crop might be something that's easy to transport, something like groundnuts. It's hard to take yams with you, but groundnuts move easily. Okay, so that's all I have for now, just to say that this cat has tools, very practical, integrates conflict and seed, but we're looking for many more examples to move forward. And I'm going to give the concluding thought to Ted, my colleague, our colleague, just to show that the seed and the conflict really is integrated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Louise. Just quickly going over some of the key takeaways for us. And one of them was around the importance of both conflict sensitivity and conflict savviness as key concepts. Another one is overall how we see that seed-linked work is increasingly taking place in conflict areas. A third one was the importance of ensuring that we do no harm by also doing good, by looking at ways to contribute to peace, in addition to making sure that we do not make matters worse in terms of exacerbating conflict. And lastly, just that it's very important that we tailor these approaches as needed, that we don't just copy old models and hope they work in conflict areas. We need a new dedicated approach for conflict areas. And within each conflict area, of course, this will need to be tailored to the specific context there. So yeah, that's it for me. I'll hand back over to Wilfred, I believe.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ted. I'll now call upon Tog to take it up on his reflections with regards to conflict. Tog?
Yes, thank you so much, Wilfred, and thank you, Louise, for also sharing those case studies. It gives us a perspective of how timely this tool is as well, even in the Nigerian context, particularly looking at the different conflicts we face on a day-to-day in Nigeria, whether it's resource-based conflicts or whether it's dealing with armed groups. There is a common theme that we have seen across all these conflicts, and it's that in the communities that are facing these conflicts, their key livelihood is actually agriculture. So this tool is timely and gives us more hope in terms of how to address some of the challenges of seed distribution in these areas. I just wanted to quickly touch on 3 points in terms of my perspective working with this tool. For a long time, a lot of the assessments we've been doing, conflict assessments, have been a step-by-step approach, right? And we do understand that in contexts like in Nigeria, for example, these conflicts are very fluid. So sometimes even before that assessment is finished, things change, and those findings might end up not being relevant in that context. So this gives us an opportunity to actually test the pulse of the community as dynamics change within the community as well, and actually use the knowledge or the findings or whatever we are seeing to actually implement and use it in its form. So it's not just an event like just ticking the box, which many of the assessments have been involved in. This actually allows you to go back, reflect, and come back with more sustainable or better solutions as well. I think the second piece is around the people-centered approach as well. We in Nigeria, some of the challenges we face around some of the conflicts we are working on is the issue of trust as well. There are great interventions, whether it's for farmers, whether it's for herders and other groups as well. However, the intention is misinterpreted, and this could be either from development partners or also the government as well. However, with this CAT tool, it provides us an opportunity for the communities themselves to actually design how that distribution of the seed distribution would look like within their context as well. And through that, groups, for example, that have long been marginalized, like, for example, pastoralists and herders in Nigeria, can begin to see hope in terms of having alternative livelihoods in which they can rely on as against their traditional way of just relying on pastoralism as the only livelihood option. And so this tool also provides an opportunity, and Ted mentioned that a bit, about identifying who those actors or who are the stakeholders within the seed system. So that gives us the opportunity to make sure that everyone is on board within that conflict system, and therefore living with the approach of social inclusion and leaving nobody behind as well. I think the last point I would like to stress is it's good to see that this is not just a siloed approach, but actually the CAT is working alongside other tools like seed system tools, or its in-depth analysis and security tools, which allows us to not only map the system itself, but also profile what is actually happening within those contexts that we are working with. So this brings out usable information that we can actually use within that system or within that conflict context in which we find ourselves. So it further allows this tool to be more relevant to the work that we do in these areas as well. So I see a lot of prospects with this tool. Like I said, it's a welcome development, but hopefully we'll get time to talk a bit about that a bit later. So I'll hand it over to my colleague Maxwell to share his own perspective as well. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Tog. Hello, everyone. This is Maxwell Samela. I work for Mercy Corps Nigeria as program director for one of our humanitarian program in the Northeast Nigeria. Yeah, so permit me to maybe quickly give you an insight into the pilot of this particular tool. So we had the privilege of hosting Wilfred in Nigeria, and we happen to be the first country, I think, that went through these tools and of course even piloted. So it was really, for us, it was really an amazing opportunity, and the fact that we were the first to more like look into it, delve into the documents, we were able to get the first-hand information. And apart from that, we also had the opportunity of going into the field to pilot this particular tool in collecting information from various stakeholders, especially farmers, and then of course, other community leaders. So there are quite a number of feedback that we received regarding, the applicability or the importance of this tool, especially looking at the agriculture component, because we've seen this document or this tool to be very relevant, especially around our agriculture, food security, and nutrition intervention. And like some other presenters mentioned, CAT is really, really comprehensive. We've known that there are quite a number of, tools that are being used for systems, assessment, but we actually found CAT to be very comprehensive. It is holistic, especially in gathering, essential information for systems. It also, gives us the understanding, of the characteristic of systems, and of course, how it relates to, conflict, either directly or indirectly. And of course, it gives us that opportunity of identifying systems, and then of course, some knowledge around the systems robustness. And then of course, if there are other maybe depleted, seats, or maybe depleted system, as a result of conflict. Another thing that we actually found about this tool is the fact that it helps point, farmers towards the right approach. And of course, it helps in identifying some of the limitations, restrictions, and of course, some of the challenges that farmers have with the seed systems. And also, one of the things that we've also discovered about this CAT is the fact that it provides information on the variety and types of seeds that is actually context specific. Going to the slides that we have, looking at the tool that we actually, piloted at the field level, we found it to be really, applicable and very relevant in terms of, asking the right questions, targeting the right participants or correspondents. And then also the questions were user-friendly, just like Todd mentioned, looking at how the tool is structured. It is really people-centered and it is user-friendly. It's easily interpreted by the, data collectors or enumerators. Again, the response to the questions also were more straightforward, without any form of, ambiguity. So it's rather straight, kind of a local farmer can easily understand the questions and even provide feedback, to the questions. And also considering the seasons, of course, one of the things that we also found out is the fact that, the timing for this assessment was somehow, wrong, because farmers are kind of full of expectation considering the season, because it's actually a planting season. So doing this kind of assessment, during this period, it will raise a lot of hopes in the community. So, but by and large, generally, this was really a great tool for us. Yeah, thank you. I think I'll stop here. Over to you, Wilfred.
Thanks a lot, my friend Maxwell. And now, of course, finally, with the CAT in the public domain, we, of course, sincerely hope that seed intervention and seed sector development in conflict-affected fragile states can move forward. Of course, at this point, let me point out that this is an evolving document, and of course, we really value your feedback. And feel free to share your thoughts with us through the contacts provided. And finally, we are moving to the questions, and I can see quite a number of them streaming in. I would like to start with this question about whether CAT is available for external users. Of course, I think that has been answered. And then there's one question from Ed Walters, that how have you adapted the questionnaires to be used remotely? I think this can be answered by Maxwell, because they recently adapted the questionnaires. Just briefly, Maxwell, on whether this can be used remotely. And then I will then ask one question coming from Andrea, and this should basically go to Ted. Ted, we talk about conflict savviness in the tool, and the question is, how does one become conflict savvy? And how would implementers identify conflict savvy informants, traders, etc.? So perhaps I will start with Ted, and then Maxwell, you can handle that, and then I will go to other questions as we move along. Just briefly.
Yeah, just briefly, I think part of when we talk about conflict savviness, part of what we're saying is that it is something that is somehow innate or intuitive that people do have when they're operating in conflict contexts. Very often it might be, colleagues or counterparts who are from the areas that they're working in. So they might have grown up experiencing some of these conflict dynamics and knowing how to navigate them. So I think that's a part of where it comes from. How does one become conflict savvy? I think, or strengthen that. I think there are a couple of elements, but briefly, one of them is just really continuing to ask questions and not assuming that you have the full picture, but trying to see, I really want to keep trying to dig deeper and uncover, understand more of what's going on and what is driving conflict, but also what can build peace. And a key part of that is to do that in as inclusive a way as possible. To say, always make sure I'm reaching out to people I haven't heard from already or those who might be left out. I think that's how you can build up your conflict savviness, and that's what you can look for in others who you hope to be able to share some of their conflict savviness with you. So I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks a lot, Ted. Maxwell, do you want to just quickly mention something?
All right, thank you, Wilfred. Yes, good question, actually. I forgot to actually mention, after the training, we had, a step down training also with the local data collectors. So who are actually working in a remote location, so outside the main capital. So the information or the pilot was actually done in a location outside the state capital. So it is easy to actually use this tool remotely, especially if you have all the software like ComCare. This can be coded using ComCare, and then it can be used at the field level remotely. Once you are able to do that. Yeah.
Good. Thanks a lot, Maxwell. And Luis, I guess this can come to you. Sean Maguire is asking this question, that what aspects of context or seed system impacts the CAT may need to be assessed more frequently than other aspects as situations change?
Yes, Sean, great question. First, I want to apologize for my camera. I scotch taped it over because I hate being pictured. Now I can't get the scotch tape off. So, Sean, I think you raised one of the issues, that the CAT is being used in a fluid period. So it's not something you do once and then you leave it off. I think the aspects that are moving, to be honest, and it'd be great to think about this with you, are the ones that have to be frequently assessed. So, are labor arrangements changing? Ethnic cooperative arrangements changing? Is infrastructure, road damage changing supply chains? So as the situation, the context, non-siege context changes, you have to anticipate how that would affect seed system changes. And that's why I think the table which we did in the document, which is just a start, the one that says, what are the conflict features that could affect seed systems, that table really needs to be fleshed out. I mean, right now, I think we have 15 features. I think we should get to 20 or 30 to help us say, which features might be fluid, and how to assess them. But great question.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Luis. And then there are two questions that I feel are related. One is Ed Walter's question on, can the tool be used by non-seed experts? And then I think it's closely related to what Carlwell wants to know about what steps are going to be taken to socialize this to the broader humanitarian community, particularly the UN agencies that typically take a leadership role in humanitarian response, and also considering that the presenters are quite steeped in seed systems, conflict, etc. So what sort of prerequisite skills are needed to conduct a CAT or SSSA? Luis, do you want to talk about this? And perhaps Ted, you can, or Tog, you can give your perspectives.
Sure. So absolutely, the CAT can be used by non-C specialists. It's lay language. It tries to reach out across the divide. And we should mention it's going to be in English and in French. What's important is the CAT, this context analysis tool for conflict areas, isn't a standalone tool. It goes very well with two other types of tools. So one, any seed system, seed emergency toolkit. For instance, like the Seed Emergency Response Toolkit, launched about 2 weeks ago. The two are fantastically paired. But in addition, the CAT goes very well with general conflict intervention analysis tools. Right? So the CAT is trying to hone in on the interface between seed systems and conflict, because to our knowledge, that's never been done. But again, broader conflict tools, broader seed systems tools, very much can complement both analysis and implementation on the ground.
Great. Ted, do you want to mention something or talk?
Yeah, maybe I can add a bit on the prerequisite skills from a conflict perspective. And Ted has already mentioned that about conflict savviness. Maybe we can bring it down to having good communication skills, right? The ability to probe, but probe in a very conflict sensitive way. The tool, for example, provides an opportunity, like we mentioned earlier, is people-centered, right? So it gives an opportunity to hear the local's perspective. If you look at traditional approaches of doing context analysis, we tend to bring in external people, and then that whole learning process is, it takes a bit longer, and sometimes it can be a bit confusing in terms of interpreting the results. So this it's a good mix of the two, right? So the communities or the farmers themselves are able to work with the conflict people to go together as to achieve one specific goal, right? So that's important as well, how we are able to work together with a different range of perspectives and a different range of stakeholders as well. And let's remember that this tool itself does not say this is the solution, right? It's providing you a guide on how, and it will change from context to context. Let's always remember that. And even within a context, there's a context as well. So I think the point here is good inquiry skills, good communication skills is one must have for anyone that wants to use this tool.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tog. And I know, Luis, you've touched on this, but I just wanted to, for the sake of the audience, just to draw a link between the CAT and the recently launched SAT. How does the CAT link with the SAT, and would a practitioner use both tools in the same context, or choose one or the other?
Yeah, so the quick answer is you would use both. The CERT stands for Seed Emergency Response Toolkit. It's an overview guide on how to do a seed security response in an emergency situation. So how do you do a diagnosis? How do you choose which type of response? What are the plus or minuses of response? And actually the CERT, as we call it, covers drought, war, flood, plant disease, a range of scenarios. The CAT, this context analysis tool, as I mentioned, focuses only on conflict. I think in the next version, which I hope will be even next year, we have to do a much better job of characterizing the different kinds of conflict. So the CAT introduces conflict and seed as a unit, but it needs to be refined a great deal more. The CAT and the CERT have to be used or can be used very usefully side by side. There's not a great deal of overlap, actually. Just going through two questions, if I may, Wilfred. Someone asked about gender. It's the CERT. Of course, it's mentioned in the CAT, but it's the CERT, the Seed Emergency Response Toolkit, that has an extensive section on gender. Someone in the guide said, what about financial access? It's the CERT that talks a great deal about vouchers and cash and their interface. So listen, the two together are not very, very hefty. We're talking about 70 pages, 50 pages, 120 pages. All doable.
Great, Luis. Thanks a lot for that great feedback. I know we just have just under 1 minute to wrap up. There's one key question about sensitivity of the questions, Tog. And I don't know if you can just in a few seconds, just give us based on your experience with peace and conflict, and of course, leading through the conflict analysis section of the CAT. What do you think about sensitivity of the questions and probably who is best placed to ask the questions? Just a few seconds and then we wrap up.
I think thank you, Wilfred. I think the best person to or people to ask these questions is everyone, right? So we do have a responsibility to be sensitive in every kind of sector or different endeavors, especially when we are working with other constituencies as well. So I would say everyone. However, we need to consciously build those skills to be conflict savvy. And I think that's what the tool provides for us. It provides a framework in which you can become conflict savvy as well. In terms of the sensitivities, let's remember that the framework for conflict sensitivity talks about understanding the context. That means understanding values, beliefs, cultures, perspectives, right? And that's not static. It's from context to context. So we need to realize that and not come with a one script across all systems. And I think Louise mentioned that having specific tools for specific conflicts as well might be something to consider as we move forward in implementing this tool as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tog, and thanks everyone. We are on top of the hour, and I guess it's now time to wrap up. I'm grateful to everyone who found time to attend this, and we hope that we have carried away something. Like Abby mentioned, the CAT is available, and there is a link there. You feel free to go through it and provide any feedback as may be. I will then hand over to James. James, do you want to just close it?
Hello, thank you, Wilfred, and everybody in the panel. Great job, Wilfred, for guiding us through this very interesting webinar. Not much for me to say, except thank you to everybody for being here today. You'll find the documents, the CERT, the CAT, all on issdafrica.org. And bye-bye for now, and wishing everybody a very pleasant day. Bye-bye.